Hey, look at that. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever time it is where you are. I wanted to talk to you again. My live stream yesterday got cut off because some things were happening. So this is about life during wartime in Israel again. A pretty grim topic, I know. But there seems to be a lot of that happening in Israel and around the world in different places. Ukraine, Yemen. There's no shortage of places where there's still warfare, right? And unfortunately, this is something that too many people know about in that sense. Too many of our fellow human beings suffer from such conflicts and nonsense. And of course, each place has its own version, its own reasons, its own awful methods of dealing with things, or none of it is pleasant. Let's just put it that way. Right? The only people that take pleasure in such a thing are either the people that are somehow involved in, instigating it because they have an ideological bent for it, or people, profiteering off it. And by that I mean like the arms makers and the military industrial complex, basically. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't any companies even within that complex, let alone others that support it or somehow profit from the situation, that are not particularly exploitative or opportunistic. There certainly are. In fact, I would argue probably most of them are not seeking blood for profit. They just happen to be making more profit when there is blood, but that isn't actually their ambition. In fact, I know quite a few who are unfortunately in the business that make effectively more money when there is bloodshed, who would absolutely love nothing more, and I mean this from the top down, knowing the founders and CEOs, they would love nothing more than to go out of business because of a lack of demand for their products and services. And I'm like, it sounds crazy. Like, well, what are you talking about? If they're making a fortune, why would they want to go out of business? Why would they want no conflict to drive them out of business? Because they would rather have peace, that's why. And I know that sounds crazy, but there are people who have in fact started firms that make things that are used to defend or to, make offensive maneuvers or whatever. And there are other companies that support with logistics or other supplies, these actions. And, yes, they had an invention or a business idea that became very profitable very quickly and then became even more profitable. There was warfare, and every time there was warfare, they became more profitable. But that doesn't mean that that's their goal, right? In some cases, their goal was literally born out of battle or born out of need, and their entire goal is actually to be out of business. And there are some companies, in fact, not just in this particular field, where you'll find that that's the case, where the founders want nothing more than to be driven out of business by a lack of demand for the services and products that they offer. I know it sounds crazy, but that's how it is. So, anyway, that is one of the many realities of living in a place that has, I would say, it's a bit of a strange relationship with warfare and all that. Would that it were not so, but it is. In any case, that is really not the main purpose of this live stream, but it is something interesting to note, and it is related to what I am unfortunately talking about today. And what I'm unfortunately talking about today is very much related to that bigger picture. In that bigger picture, that bigger picture is one that deals with, well, maybe that isn't the bigger picture, actually, I should rephrase that. It's a more fine-grained picture, so it's actually more specific rather than higher level. On the one hand, we'll start with the fine grain, and then we'll zoom out for the bigger picture at the end. So on the more fine-grained level, when it comes to life during wartime in Israel again, and by the way, in other places where there's war, it's a very common thing for businesses to deviate from the norm. And you'll find that, some percentage of the companies will deviate from the norm. Partly out of necessity, because maybe the war has directly impacted their ability to conduct business as usual. Partly out of, perceived opportunity, because they may see some particular strategic advantage to change things a little bit, temporarily at least. Partly out of they don't know a different way to do things, and they're willing to experiment. Partly curiosity, like, hey, what if we did this? What if we did this instead of that? Let's A/B test some ideas. And when I say the ones that don't know any better, that's because they don't know how else to operate other than to try something different, because it seems almost natural to try something different when you're in a situation that is very different from the norm. And then there'll be a whole host of companies, in fact, the majority, that will actually just do their best to keep calm and carry on. And in a way, that is really what's necessary, especially for institutionalized or institutional organizations, whether they be public or private, large organizations like banks or post offices or hospitals or, whatever it is, right? Even schools, although usually what happens with schools, because if we're dealing about schools with children as opposed to colleges and universities, schools for children usually are affected immediately by catastrophic events, and normally they will defer to caution, and normally what that means is they will pause regular school. There was a time when that might have been different, but now, in the age of the internet and everything else, Zooms, Google Meets, whatnot, they will tend to stay closed in order to be available for all the students while keeping them safe at home, but to be available to them for online meetings, etc. Now, why is that useful? Well, it's useful a little bit for certain people say, who have kids that are quite young, and maybe one of the parents is at home throughout the day. Rarely are both, but it does happen. In most societies anyway, you have about 90% or more usually of the population is employed. Even in a country with war, that's very prolonged and very terrible, you have usually more than 80% of the working force, or the labor force, will be working, right? So, of course, there are places where it's far, far worse than that, right? Like in Syria, where you obviously have a much higher unemployment rate, and they don't all have internet connections and whatever. So there, and the war is raging since many years already. The active war, in the sense of there's still a hot war going on there since more than 10 years. And yes, it's calmed down a little bit in that the government has taken over most of the land there, but there are still very active gunfights between the Islamists and the Syrian forces, right? So it's not a done deal by any means, and it's very active and it can be very violent at times, right? So in places like that, where they may have, in some of the elite schools or some of the better schools, they may have Google Meets or Zooms or whatever, but they're so used to it already with this generation that they've already gone back to class. Whereas in other places where there's war that's relatively newer, relatively newer conflict that are less than a week old, or less than a month old, or less than a year old, or less than a few years old, in those places you can still see a lot of classes kind of staying shut for the time being, and just meeting online, which is, it has its pros and cons. Because, yes, of course, by not having all the kids concentrated in one place, you kind of keep them out of harm's way. At the same time, you also put their education in harm's way by not having them attend classes. And, of course, life is more important than, going to class, right? Like being alive is more important than going to a class. Obviously, if you can't be alive, you can't go to any classes. However, well, okay. Let's do that. However, it is highly unlikely that kids will learn as well online as they do in class, at least when they're young, although there's still some advantage to it. But there are disadvantages as well. The lack of social engagement, meeting with kids, doing routine things that are helping them to grow and learn, that not every parent has the ability to necessarily do on their own. And there are other issues that come up with that. So, and other institutions as well that shut down due to warfare have to deal with these questions. Anyway, I have to do something, so